Hello, my dear friends. They were the men who died alone in the sky, long before anyone even knew they were gone. Their stories were scattered across frozen air, broken metal, and empty tail compartments where silence always arrived before help. Secrets hid in those narrow spaces, where courage was never witnessed and fear had no one to speak to. Tonight you will step into the cold, isolated world they endured and feel what it meant to survive or vanish behind a B-17. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone were to step into the narrow fuselage of a B-17 and crawl toward its farthest compartment, they would eventually reach a place that felt less like part of an aircraft and more like an afterthought carved into metal. The tail position sat alone at the end of the bomber, sealed off by tight passageways and the heavy hum of engines that vibrated through every rib of the airframe. It was a space so removed from the others that the men who occupied it often said they felt more like observers of the war than members of a crew. Inside that confined bubble, the noise of the aircraft shifted into something hollow and distant, creating a strange sense of being present, yet unconnected to everything happening ahead. No footsteps were passing by, no reassuring glances from fellow airmen, no chance for a hand on the shoulder to steady a moment of fear. Distance turned quickly into loneliness, and loneliness turned into something even heavier. The tail gunner sat hunched beneath the curved glass, knees drawn toward his chest because the structure offered no room to stretch or ease his body. To reach him required crawling through a tunnel so narrow that even breathing felt measured. To help him in an emergency required time he would not have. If he were wounded, there was no direct path for rescue. The rest of the crew could only shout through the intercom, hoping their voices carried through the static, hoping he was conscious enough to reply. The radio became both a lifeline and a reminder that he was separated by metal, machinery, and the cold conditions of high-altitude flight. Every exchange was brief, clipped, and impersonal, as if the distance smoothed emotion into fragments of information. The isolation deepened with each mission. Minutes felt longer near the tail than anywhere else on the bomber. The gunner watched the sky stretch endlessly behind them, a corridor of open air that held both beauty and threat. When no enemy approached, there was a strange stillness that wrapped around him, a kind of muted suspension that made the rest of the world seem very far away. When enemy fighters did appear, the silence shattered into urgency, and yet, even then, he remained alone in that fragile shell of aluminium and glass. It is unsettling to imagine sitting in that cold compartment, hearing only the low rumble of engines and the thin buzz of the intercom, knowing that everyone else existed just out of reach. The design of the aircraft treated the tail as a strategic necessity rather than a human workspace. It was a place to put guns, not a place to put a man. Safety considerations were minimal, comfort was irrelevant. The gunner's seat was barely more than a mounted frame with thin padding, and there was no easy way to adjust his posture. Even small movements required awkward twisting, and any shift in turbulence made the space feel even smaller. The longer he stayed there, the more the compartment pressed in on him, reminding him that he was enclosed by metal not much thicker than a kitchen pan. The tail vibrated, flexed and swayed with every change in air pressure, a constant reminder that he was riding at the edge of the aircraft's endurance. Communication was unreliable at best. Static cut across voices, and the intercom crackled with distortions that turned words into indistinct murmurs. Sometimes the gunner spoke and no one heard him. Sometimes he called out a warning and received no reply, forcing him to trust that the crew had heard enough to act. It is almost absurd that such a vital role depended on fragile wires and a switch the size of a thumbprint. Yet, in wartime, practicality often dictated decisions that overlooked human vulnerability. There were moments when the gunner wasn't sure whether the silence meant the line had gone dead, or whether the others simply had nothing to say. What made this isolation more profound was the sense that the sky itself became a companion. Clouds drifted by like mute witnesses, space stretched without limit. The earth below moved slowly, detached from whatever took place inside the aircraft. In this lonely vantage point, the gunner saw the world differently from the rest of the crew, always from behind, always from a distance, always through a frame that reminded him he was the last to see anything that approached. The position shaped a mindset of constant vigilance, even when nothing stirred. Stillness could be comforting for a moment, but it also whispered of danger that might rush forward without warning. The contradictions of the role were harsh. The gunner was essential, but treated as peripheral. He was part of the team, but he was placed where no team could reach him. His view was vast, yet his world was small. Each mission forced him to accept that the very design of the aircraft demanded his separation, and that separation carried its own weight. The bomber depended on him, yet the aircraft itself kept him at a distance that magnified every fear. It is difficult to imagine another wartime position where duty and isolation intertwined so completely, turning a man into both guardian and ghost within the same fragile space. What he endured in that narrow compartment reveals how deeply isolation shaped the life of a tail gunner. Yet separation was only the beginning of his struggle, for the sky held more than loneliness. Another truth waited above the clouds, and it carried a far sharper edge than solitude ever could. The tail compartment of the B-17 was never meant to hold a human body comfortably, and anyone entering it for the first time understood this instantly. The space narrowed into a cramped shell of curved metal, a place where a man could neither stand nor fully extend his legs. Every movement was dictated by the shape of the aircraft rather than the needs of the person inside it, forcing the tail gunner to curl himself into whatever posture the structure allowed. He sat with his knees drawn upward, shoulders rounded, and spine bent in a way that felt unnatural even before the aircraft left the ground. Once the bomber lifted into the sky, the cold air pressing against the fuselage made the metal stiffen, and the cramped space seemed to shrink further as hours passed. There was no opportunity to shift freely or stretch aching muscles. The gunner had to maneuver with small, careful motions, twisting just enough to check his weapons or adjust his view. Even these tiny actions became laborious after a long mission. The body strained against the confines and the joints tightened until they trembled with fatigue. The position offered no relief for the lower back, no place to rest the elbows, and no posture that allowed true rest. This discomfort did not simply accompany the work, it shaped the entire experience, making exhaustion a constant companion long before the first enemy fighter appeared. Light inside the compartment was minimal. The only illumination came from what filtered through the small, curved windows surrounding the gunner's position. These patches of visibility were more symbolic than practical, offering glimmers of the sky while leaving most of the interior in dim shadow. The gunner worked in a world of softened outlines and muted shapes, relying on instinct and training to manage equipment that was often hard to see clearly. Even the gun barrels he controlled seemed to dissolve into the darkness when he turned his head away from the thin beam of daylight. It created a sense of floating inside a hollow, half-lit sphere, suspended between the open sky and the dark interior. The limited visibility also affected the gunner's awareness of his surroundings. He could rarely see the rest of the aircraft, could not observe his fellow crew members, and could not glance forward to understand what maneuvers the pilot was attempting. He viewed the world entirely through the small arc behind the bomber, staring out into an expanse that felt both vast and strangely confined. The narrow field forced him to focus on one direction, reducing his perception of danger to whatever entered that restricted slice of sky. Everything outside that frame remained unknown, and the unknown carried its own weight. Every vibration of the aircraft passed directly into the gunner's bones. The tail section flexed more than the forward compartments, bending and trembling with air currents that the rest of the crew barely noticed. For the gunner, these movements amplified the sense of instability. The metal skin seemed to breathe under his hands, expanding and contracting with pressure changes, reminding him that he was seated in one of the most fragile parts of the bomber. The thin frame surrounding him provided the illusion of a protective shell, but one sharp burst of gunfire could tear through it as though it were paper. That knowledge sat heavily alongside the physical discomfort, filling the small space with an unspoken tension. Despite these challenges, the gunner had to maintain perfect control over his weapons. The position of the guns required him to reach outward, angling his arms in ways that strained the muscles and restricted circulation. Repeated firing only intensified the discomfort, sending vibrations up his forearms and into his shoulders. After hours in the cold and the cramped posture, his fingers stiffened, and even simple tasks such as adjusting ammunition belts became clumsy efforts. The compartment seemed to conspire against precision, yet precision was exactly what the job demanded. The physical closeness to the aircraft's tail also created a strange psychological environment. The gunner was separated from the rest of the crew by more than distance. He was separated by the physical reality of the space that held him captive. It felt like being locked inside a metal cocoon, one that magnified every hardship while muting any sense of connection to others. It is difficult to imagine enduring such confinement while knowing that danger could appear at any moment, and that one's ability to respond depended entirely on movements constrained by the very walls meant to protect. The space reduced the gunner to necessity. He was not given comfort because comfort was considered irrelevant. He was given only what was required for the guns to function, and everything else was sacrificed. Over time, the cramped environment shapes not only his physical state, but also his mindset. His world narrowed to the curve of metal around him, the slight arc of glass revealing the sky, and the quiet hum of his own breath trapped in the cold air. In that small enclosure, the gunner learned to accept discomfort as natural, to treat pain as familiar, and to measure time not in minutes, but in the numbness spreading slowly through his limbs. This entire arrangement reveals how the aircraft demanded more from the gunner than space could offer. It forced the human body into shapes it was never meant to hold, and produced endurance born not from choice, but from necessity. Yet within that confinement, the gunner carried on, aware that the sky outside held far greater threats than the ones pressing in from the metal walls around him. What he endured in that cramped shell shows how the aircraft reshaped the very idea of endurance for those assigned to its tail. Yet discomfort was only one burden he carried, for the dangers awaiting outside the glass would soon overshadow every ache. And there was a moment ahead when the confined space would become the least of his fears. The sky behind a B-17 was never an empty canvas. It was a hunting ground where silence could break in an instant. For the tail gunner, this space was not merely a backdrop, but the source of nearly every threat he would ever face. Enemy fighters favoured approaches from the rear, where the bomber's vast frame offered a clear target, and where the gunner stood as the only barrier between survival and destruction. The moment a fighter appeared, the calm expanse transformed into a narrow corridor of danger, a place where seconds carried the weight of life and death. From his isolated position, the gunner watched shapes emerge from the horizon, growing larger with unsettling speed, each one a predator closing in on a trapped animal. There was no one beside him to help identify the incoming aircraft or share the burden of defense. The rest of the crew relied on him to spot threats long before they entered firing range, trusting his eyes to catch even the faintest glint of metal in the distance. This responsibility pressed on him more heavily than the cold or the cramped posture. He alone had to stay constantly alert, sweeping the sky without pause, his vision strained by the harsh light and shifting clouds. Any lapse, even a brief moment of distraction, could allow an enemy fighter to approach unseen, endangering not only him, but everyone on board. When the attack began, the gunner had to act without hesitation. There was no time to call for guidance, no chance to coordinate with those farther forward in the aircraft. Everything depended on instinct, muscle memory, and the ability to manage several actions at once. He had to load ammunition belts smoothly, check the alignment of the guns, adjust his aim, and track the unpredictable movements of an aircraft diving toward him. These tasks overlapped in a frantic rhythm, each one demanding precision under circumstances that offered none. The tail compartment's narrow walls restricted his motion, forcing him to fight within a space barely large enough to accommodate his own body. The enemy fighters attacked with ruthless efficiency. They approached head-on toward the tail position, guns blazing, knowing that a well-placed burst could sever the bomber's rear section or kill the gunner outright. Their speed created a terrifying visual effect. The sky compressed into a tunnel, and every second of delay meant the attacker grew twice as large. The gunner watched as tracers cut through the air like streaks of burning wire, some flying past his position, others striking the thin metal skin with harsh, jarring impacts. The aircraft shuddered under the assault, and the tail flexed violently, amplifying the sense of vulnerability. Within this chaos, aiming became a test of discipline rather than calm. The gunner had to anticipate the fighter's path, leading his shots through the air while compensating for turbulence, recoil, and the constant sway of the bomber. The enemy could change direction at any moment, and every adjustment required a new calculation. His hands moved with frantic precision, gripping cold metal that numbed his fingers, while his breath fogged the inside of the glass. It is almost impossible to imagine maintaining accuracy in such conditions. Yet for the gunner, accuracy meant survival. The psychological pressure was equally severe. The gunner knew that if he failed, the fighter would not simply pass by. It would strike again and again, targeting him until the bomber fell from the sky. There was no illusion of safety, no shield to hide behind. His body was pressed against the thin barrier separating him from open air, and the knowledge that a single bullet could tear through both metal and flesh added a sharp edge to every movement. The tail gunner did not merely defend the aircraft, he absorbed the first wave of every attack, becoming the point where violence concentrated before spreading through the rest of the bomber. Each engagement left a lingering tension that did not fade once the fighter disappeared. The gunner's ears rang from the deafening blasts, his arms ached from the recoil, and his eyes burned from the strain of tracking evasive targets. Yet there was no moment to rest, because another threat could appear at any time. The constant cycle of anticipation, followed by sudden violence, created a state of sustained alertness that bordered on exhaustion. In this way, the air battles did not end when the gunfire ceased. They continued in the quiet moments, when the gunner replayed each second in his mind, wondering whether he would have the strength to endure the next attack. The fighter assaults also intensified the sense of isolation. While the rest of the crew heard the gunfire and felt the bomber tremble, they could not see what the tail gunner saw. They had no way of understanding the speed at which the enemy approached, or the danger concentrated in that narrow slice of sky. From their positions, the battle felt distant, filtered through the hum of engines and the crackle of the intercom. For the gunner, it was immediate and intimate, a confrontation where he looked directly into the path of destruction. The difference in perspective widened the gap between him and the rest of the crew, reinforcing the feeling that he faced a separate war of his own. In these attacks, the gunner confronted not just enemy pilots, but the brutal reality of his role. The aircraft entrusted him with defending the most vulnerable point of its structure, while offering little protection in return. The balance between offense and defense shifted constantly, and each mission demanded both physical endurance and emotional steadiness. What he experienced during these moments revealed the harsh truth that the sky behind the B-17 was both his duty and his greatest threat. His battles with the pursuing fighters show how danger converged on the fragile space he guarded. Yet these clashes were only one layer of the burden he carried, for the aircraft itself held challenges that pressed even harder. Something far more unsettling waited in the shadows of that tail compartment, revealing itself only when the threat of enemy fire briefly faded. Death did not approach the tail gunner from above or below, or from some distant horizon. It approached directly from behind, carried on the wings of enemy fighters that understood exactly where the B-17 was weakest. The tail section was a narrow spine extending into the sky, a fragile limb exposed to every burst of incoming fire. When a fighter opened its guns, the bullets travelled straight into that exposed corridor, striking metal so thin that it offered little more resistance than sheeted ice. The gunner sat directly in the path of those bursts, aware with chilling clarity that he occupied the first point of impact. If the enemy hit the tail, he would feel it before anyone else, and often he would feel nothing afterward at all. The rear fuselage absorbed punishment poorly. A well-placed burst could shear through critical supports, causing the structure to twist violently under the pressure of air rushing past. Even small holes widened under strain, tearing into jagged shapes that caught the wind with destructive force. The gunner felt every vibration, every tremor, every shudder that passed through the tail. It was as though the aircraft was constantly reminding him of how little separated him from the open sky. Metal groaned behind him after each attack, and the cold geometry of the guns pressed against his body, as if urging him to brace for whatever might come next. In many missions, the enemy did not need to destroy the entire aircraft. All it took was one focused strike to the tail. The impact could rupture control cables, sever stabilizers, or snap the narrow frame that held the section together. When this happened, the tail sometimes broke away completely, spiraling into the void, while the rest of the bomber tried to limp onward. The gunner, strapped into his position, had no way to escape. The compartment became its own falling world, a fragment of an aircraft tumbling through layers of cold air. Reports from surviving crews described these moments with a kind of stunned detachment, as if the mind struggled to grasp the speed at which everything ended for the man at the rear. Even when the tail did not separate, a direct hit often killed the gunner instantly. The enemy aimed deliberately at his position because they knew he was both vulnerable and essential. One burst could penetrate the glass, shred the mounts, and strike the body seated within that small enclosure. The violence of the impact left no room for reaction. Sometimes the crew would call out to the gunner and receive no reply, realizing only moments later that the silence did not come from a malfunction, but from sudden death. The isolation that defined his role became even more haunting in these moments, for it allowed death to arrive quietly, unnoticed until the battle moved on. There were accounts of bodies expelled from the aircraft during combat, flung outward by the force of explosions or abrupt structural failure. These images lingered among airmen long after missions ended. Witnesses described seeing a shape fall away from the tail, still curled in the posture of a man gripping his guns. The idea that someone could be ejected in the midst of action, still locked into the reflex of defense, revealed a grim truth about the final moments many gunners experienced. They died in the same positions they had fought, their bodies frozen in the instinct to protect the aircraft, even as it abandoned them to the sky. The crew understood this danger on every mission. They respected the tail gunner for enduring a threat that did not merely hover over the aircraft, but pursued it relentlessly. While the rest of the bomber braced for attacks that might come from many angles, the gunner braced for the angle that was always preferred by the enemy. He stared into the space where fighters gathered their speed, where they aligned their sights, where they learned to read the patterns of the bomber's movement. There was a strange intimacy to the encounter. The gunner looked directly into the path of approaching death, and the pilots attacking him looked directly back. This constant awareness of danger fostered a mindset shaped by vigilance. The gunner could not afford fear, though he felt it. He could not indulge panic, though he lived moments that would have terrified most men. Instead, he developed a steady alertness, an internal discipline that allowed him to function in circumstances where death hovered close enough to taste in the cold air. Yet discipline did not erase the reality that a single second of misjudgment could end everything. The fragility of his position was always present, an unspoken companion sitting beside him in the cramped compartment. The tail gunner's role became a study in contrasts. He was the farthest from the crew, yet the first to face the enemy. He guarded the rear of the aircraft, yet he lacked the protection others took for granted. He served as a final shield, yet his own defences were painfully thin. What he endured in the heat of battle did not come from abstract risk, but from immediate and repeated confrontation with a threat designed specifically to reach him first. It is difficult to imagine any soldier carrying such a burden while confined to a space barely large enough to move. All of this reveals why the tail position carried a reputation for inevitability. It was not simply dangerous, it was a station where danger concentrated, where survival depended on instinct sharpened by fear. The gunner fought not only the enemy, but the knowledge that his death would arrive from behind, without warning, without sound, until the moment the metal burst open. His constant proximity to death shows how the sky behind the bomber became a place of relentless threat. Yet this exposure was only one aspect of the burden he carried, for the aircraft demanded more from him than reaction alone. Some challenges pressed even harder, shaped not by combat, but by the unforgiving environment surrounding the tail. A deeper strain waited at high altitude, where cold and oxygen turned survival into a different kind of battle. The tail gunner's world was defined not by the endless sky surrounding the aircraft, but by the narrow arc of glass that framed his position. The guns he operated were mounted on tracks that allowed only limited movement, restricting his ability to follow targets that drifted too high, too low, or too far to either side. His field of fire resembled a narrow funnel, aimed at the space directly behind the bomber, a passage through which enemy fighters often passed, but just as often evaded. Each adjustment of the guns required careful coordination, yet no degree of skill could overcome the fundamental boundaries imposed by the weapon mounts. The sky might have stretched in every direction, but the gunner could access only a fraction of it, The glass enclosure surrounding him added another layer of restriction. Shaped like a shallow U, the frame cut into his view, creating blind spots that turned portions of the sky into zones of uncertainty. He could lean slightly to one side or angle his head to expand his sightline, but the curvature of the compartment denied him anything resembling a full perspective. The enemy understood this limitation well. Fighters learned to approach along arcs the gunner could not easily track, slipping momentarily out of sight before reappearing within firing range. Each disappearance created a moment of tension, a brief pause where the gunner had to guess the intention of a pilot he could no longer see. The fragility of this vision shaped every decision he made. The gunner knew he could not rely solely on what he saw. He had to read subtle signs, a flicker of sunlight on metal, the faint shadow of a wing against cloud, the direction of tracer fire cutting toward the aircraft. These fragments of perception became clues to threats lurking beyond his immediate sight. Yet even with heightened awareness, he could not anticipate everything. The limited view demanded constant vigilance, and vigilance produced a mental exhaustion that settled deeper than physical fatigue. The mind strained to fill the gaps left by the narrow window, trying to assemble a complete picture from pieces that never quite aligned. This constrained visibility also affected his communication with the crew. When he called out an approaching fighter, he could describe only what lay within his restricted arc. If an enemy slipped to the sides, he could not track it long enough to provide reliable updates. The crew depended on him to warn them of rear threats, but the very structure of his position prevented him from seeing threats approaching at oblique angles. It is unsettling to imagine relying on a single man for rear defense, while simultaneously placing him inside a compartment that denied him the full view he needed to perform that task. Yet this was the reality of the tail position, a blend of necessity and compromise. The guns themselves reinforced these limitations. Their mounts allowed movement in predictable patterns, but not in the fluid arcs a fighter might take when diving into attack. The gunner could swing the weapons left or right, raise or lower them, but as the aircraft shook or banked, the angles shifted in ways that made precision difficult. He often found himself chasing targets that slipped just beyond the reach of his guns, forced to anticipate where the enemy would move rather than where they were. This constant prediction created a sense of pursuing shadows, always reacting, but rarely controlling the engagement. When the bomber entered combat formations, the restricted field became even more challenging. Other aircraft in the formation filled portions of the sky the gunner might otherwise have watched. He had to distinguish friendly silhouettes from enemy shapes, sometimes making decisions in fractions of a second. A narrow field of vision meant reduced time for judgment. Every mistake carried consequences. Seeing too little could expose the bomber to danger, but reacting too quickly could risk friendly fire. The balance demanded calmness under pressure, a trait difficult to maintain inside a vibrating, freezing compartment with limited visibility. Despite these challenges, the gunner learned to adapt. He memorized common attack patterns, studied how enemy pilots maneuvered, and developed instincts that compensated for the shortcomings of the equipment. The constraints shaped his perception so completely that he began to think in terms of arcs and angles rather than open space. His skill did not expand the field of view, but it sharpened his ability to use the narrow corridor effectively. Yet even mastery could not erase the reality that large portions of the sky remained invisible to him. In war, what cannot be seen becomes what must be feared. The psychological effect of this narrowed world created its own weight. While other crew members had instruments, windows, and broader sight lines, the tail gunner lived in a confined frame through which danger appeared suddenly and often without warning. He stared into a limited slice of sky, knowing that death could emerge from directions he could not monitor. This knowledge did not fade with experience. It remained a constant presence, an invisible pressure that shaped every mission. The narrow window became both his shield and his prison, offering a controlled view of the world while concealing threats just beyond its edges. These combined limitations transformed the gunner's role into one of perpetual uncertainty. His efforts were precise, his focus intense, yet the environment denied him the tools needed to perform his duty with confidence. He sat in a space designed to defend the aircraft's most vulnerable point, yet he did so without the ability to observe the full scope of what endangered it. This contrast between responsibility and restriction revealed the deeper truth of his experience. He fought bravely within boundaries imposed not by skill, but by design. His narrow field of sight shows how the sky itself became fragmented for the man guarding the tail. Yet this restricted vision was only one aspect of the strain he faced, for the air at high altitude brought dangers that cut deeper than any blind spot. Something within that thin atmosphere waited to challenge not only what he could see, but what his body could endure. High above the clouds, the air that surrounded the B-17 looked calm and endless. But for the men inside the aircraft, it carried a quiet threat. At altitude, the atmosphere thinned until there was scarcely enough oxygen to keep a human conscious. For the tail gunner, confined to the fragile shell at the rear of the bomber, this invisible danger pressed against him from every side. The cold seeped through the metal, and the air grew thin enough that even a few breaths without assistance could send his mind spinning into darkness. There was no luxury of slow decline. Oxygen deprivation struck swiftly and without mercy, dissolving strength in minutes and consciousness in seconds. The oxygen mask became his lifeline, a constant presence that clung to his face throughout the mission. It delivered steady breaths of thin, cold air, keeping his body functional in a space where survival relied more on equipment than on human resilience. The mask was not optional, not for a single moment. If it slipped, if a strap loosened, if the valve froze, the consequences arrived with startling speed. A wave of dizziness would creep into the edges of vision, the world would tilt, and thought itself would begin to unravel. It was a danger unlike gunfire or enemy fighters. It was quiet, internal, and indifferent to courage. The fragility of the oxygen system heightened this threat. At high altitudes, the cold stiffened the rubber, slowed airflow, and encouraged moisture from the gunner's breath to freeze inside the tubing. A thin layer of frost could block the passage entirely. The simple act of breathing, something automatic on the ground, became a function of mechanical reliability. The gunner listened for the hiss of oxygen as carefully as he watched the sky. If the sound faltered or stopped, he had only moments to react. The idea that a man could die simply because ice formed where warmth once lingered feels almost absurd. Yet this was a constant reality in the upper atmosphere. The darkness brought on by oxygen failure was not gentle. It arrived with confusion and a sudden loosening of thought, followed by an overwhelming physical weakness that made even simple movements feel impossible. A gunner deprived of oxygen could lose control of his limbs, slump forward over his guns, or become unresponsive without ever realizing that danger had begun. The crew expected him to remain alert, to watch for fighters, to guard the rear of the bomber. They rarely paused to consider how easily the thin air could steal consciousness from him. The responsibility of vigilance collided with the bodily demands of altitude, creating a tension no amount of training could fully resolve. Even when the mask functioned properly, breathing through it at altitude was far from comfortable. The air arrived cold and sharp, chilling the sinuses and throat. Each inhale carried the sterile bite of processed oxygen, and each exhale filled the mask with warmth that condensed instantly into droplets. Over time, the moisture froze along the edges of the mask, forming thin crystals that pressed against the skin. The cold metal around the gunner amplified this sensation, sending shivers through his face with every breath. The mask kept him alive, but it also reminded him constantly of the environment that sought to do the opposite. The tail gunner's isolation intensified this challenge. If a forward crew member experienced oxygen trouble, someone might notice. Voices could falter, sentences might break, and there were men nearby to intervene. But in the tail, the gunner sat alone. No one could see him. No one noticed if his speech grew slurred. No one could reach him quickly if he collapsed. His survival depended entirely on his ability to monitor himself and his equipment. It is unsettling to imagine sitting in that narrow compartment, knowing that a single malfunction could cause consciousness to slip quietly away while the engines roared and the mission continued without him. The cold at altitude worked against every safeguard the bomber carried. Frost crept into joints, wiring stiffened, and oxygen regulators grew sluggish. The gunner had to adjust the flow carefully, increasing it when the air grew thinner or when exertion demanded more effort. Even these small adjustments were complicated by gloves stiffened by the cold and fingers numbed from hours of exposure. The tail position received the worst of the freezing wind that swept along the fuselage. The chill wrapped itself around the compartment, settling into the gunner's bones and dimming his dexterity. Oxygen equipment designed for deliberate, steady use now requires precision from hands barely capable of fine movement. The psychological pressure added yet another layer. The gunner existed in the state of persistent awareness, constantly checking the tightness of the straps, the sound of the airflow, the feel of the mask against his skin. This vigilance competed with his combat responsibilities. He had to watch the sky while also monitoring his own breath, a task so fundamental that its importance might be overlooked until it was too late. The fear of silent, invisible suffocation lingered in the background of every mission, a private tension he rarely shared with the crew. When missions stretched long into the day, fatigue heightened the danger. A tired gunner might forget to adjust his oxygen flow or fail to notice the early signs of hypoxia. A moment's lapse could cause blurred vision, impaired judgment, or sudden unconsciousness. The same altitude that provided strategic advantage for the bomber worked relentlessly against the bodies of the men inside it. The gunner understood this paradox intimately. The higher they flew, the safer the aircraft became, yet the more precarious his own survival grew. This delicate balance between life and the thin air outside defined the tail gunner's reality. His body depended on equipment that could freeze, fail, or falter at any moment. His awareness depended on oxygen that could vanish without warning, and his survival depended on his ability to manage both while enduring cold, isolation, and combat. His struggle with the thin air shows how altitude demanded more than skill. It demanded constant vigilance to remain conscious at all. Yet this invisible pressure was only one element of the physical toll he endured, for the cold itself carved deeper wounds into every mission. A harsher truth lingered within that frozen wind, waiting to reveal just how deeply the environment could break a man. The cold at high altitude did not merely surround the tail gunner, it invaded his body with a precision that felt almost deliberate. At 25,000 feet, the temperature sank to levels that stripped warmth from flesh faster than the mind could register. Every surface inside the tail compartment radiated this bitter chill. Metal stiffened into something unforgiving, breathing out cold that settled into the gunner's bones. His heavy flight suit, lined with layers meant to trap heat, offered only partial relief. The frigid air seeped through seams and cuffs, curling around his limbs like a silent adversary. Even before the enemy appeared, the cold had already begun its assault. The gunner felt it first in his fingers. They stiffened inside his gloves despite the insulation, growing numb in ways that made simple tasks require deliberate effort. Adjusting ammunition belts, gripping the handles of the guns, or even shifting within the cramped compartment demanded constant focus. The joints in his hands moved sluggishly, as though they belonged to someone else. The cold dulled sensation but sharpened pain, creating that strange paradox where the skin felt both numb and burning. It became difficult to tell whether the discomfort came from the air itself or from the strain of forcing frozen muscles to comply. Metal was especially treacherous. It absorbed the cold until it reached a temperature that could cling to skin like ice does to warm breath. Any accidental touch of bare flesh to exposed metal carried immediate consequences. Skin would adhere to the surface in a sudden, biting grip, tearing away layers if pulled back quickly, or freezing into place if left too long. Even the edges of tools or the outer frame of the guns became hazards. The gunner learned to move carefully, guarding every part of himself against contact. It is unsettling to imagine working in a space where the instruments of survival could so easily injure the person trying to use them. Inside the tail compartment, the cold collected in ways that were uneven and unpredictable. The curved glass allowed frigid winds to press directly onto the gunner's face, numbing his nose and cheeks despite the mask he wore. When the bomber turned sharply or descended briefly through turbulent layers, gusts of freezing air slipped through gaps in the fuselage. These sudden drafts swept across his body with a force that made him flinch, even when he expected them. Over long missions, the cold accumulated like sediment, settling deeper and deeper until his body trembled without pause. The flight suit, designed to slow the loss of heat, could not fully protect him. Beneath its layers, the gunner's body struggled to maintain warmth, burning energy faster than food or rest could replenish. His breath formed frost along the edges of his mask, creating thin crystals that crackled softly when he moved. Moisture from sweat, unable to evaporate properly in the cold, dampened the inner layers of his clothing. This dampness chilled his skin even further, turning his protective gear into a trap that held cold as effectively as it once held warmth. Every hour in the air magnified the sensation until shivering became a constant rhythm, as natural as the rumble of the engines. The cold affected not just the body but the mind. It dulled concentration, slowed reaction time, and blurred the edge of awareness. Thoughts drifted more easily, pulled away by the numbing air. The gunner had to fight to stay mentally anchored, forcing himself to maintain focus, despite the fog settling over his senses. The environment tested his endurance long before the enemy did. While the crew forward handled instruments and watched the sky through broader windows, the gunner in the tail battled an invisible force that pressed steadily against him without pause. Every adjustment of the guns required strength he barely retained. Recoil, harmless on the ground, felt heavier in the cold, jarring, frozen muscles and straining, stiffened joints. Even breathing through the oxygen mask carried its own discomfort. The air flowed across his face in a cold stream that made his skin tighten. Frost built up at the edges, forming small ridges that pressed against his cheeks. The cold became a form of constant pressure, shaping every decision and movement. It was impossible not to think of it, impossible to forget, impossible to ignore. It was as present as any enemy pursuing the bomber from behind. Despite all of this, missions continued for hours. Time stretched in the cold, becoming something sharp and tangible. Minutes grew heavy, and each moment felt longer than the one before it. The gunner counted not the distance travelled or the altitude reached, but the creeping numbness in his fingers and the steady decline of warmth in his legs. The body's natural responses worked against him. Shivering consumed energy and concentration. Numbness reduced dexterity. Pain signalled danger too late to prevent it. The cold revealed the limits of human resilience with brutal clarity. This environment turned the tail compartment into more than a workspace. It became a test of endurance layered atop the demands of combat. The gunner fought both the enemy outside and the elements inside, caught between threats that cared nothing for bravery or discipline. The cold did not roar or strike. It seeped, pressed, and claimed strength a little at a time. What he endured at altitude revealed how the environment itself could undermine the aircraft's defences simply by breaking down the man who guarded its rear. His struggle against the freezing air shows how the cold carved deeper wounds into every mission than any weapon ever could. Yet even this relentless chill was only one part of the danger surrounding him, for the tail compartment held risks that turned every sudden jolt into a gamble with survival. Another realization waited within the trembling frame of the bomber, revealing how easily harm could emerge from the aircraft itself as it shuddered through the sky. Inside the narrow shell of the tail compartment, the gunner's body was never fully secure. The aircraft vibrated constantly, shaking under the force of engines, wind, and shifting air pressure. These movements seemed minor when felt through the fuselage as a whole, but in the tail, where the structure narrowed and flexed, they became sharper, more violent, and less predictable. Every jolt passed directly into the gunner's frame, rattling through his bones and forcing him to steady himself against the cold metal. He was held in place by a single strap that crossed his torso, more symbolic than protective, leaving his upper body exposed to whatever the sky delivered. In this fragile arrangement, even a small motion could become dangerous. The tail section moved with an unsettling independence from the rest of the aircraft. Air turbulence caused it to whip slightly from side to side, and evasive maneuvers amplified this movement until the compartment felt like its own separate vessel. The gunner sat within this swaying world, gripping his guns as the structure around him trembled with every gust. The lack of proper restraints meant that his head remained vulnerable. When the aircraft lurched, nothing stopped his skull from slamming forward into the thick glass panel or backward into the metal supports. These collisions, though unintentional, carried brutal force when combined with the momentum of the aircraft. The curved glass directly in front of him was both his window to the world and one of his greatest hazards. Designed to give a limited view of the sky behind the bomber, it was mounted too close to his face for comfort. When turbulence struck, the gunner's head could be thrown into it before he had time to react. The impact was swift and unforgiving, producing a dull, sickening sound inside the compartment. Even with a helmet, the force could cause concussions, disorientation, or immediate unconsciousness. Without a helmet, or if the helmet shifted slightly, the results could be far worse. There were cases where sudden turbulence or an abrupt maneuver caused fatal injuries. A sharp drop could throw the gunner upward and forward. A sideways jolt could twist his neck violently. A sudden climb could force his head into the metal supports behind him. These incidents occurred not during enemy fire, but during routine flight conditions, which made them even more unsettling. Death or severe injury could arrive in complete silence, without warning, without any trace of combat. It is difficult to imagine enduring such fragility within an aircraft built to withstand the force of war. The gunner's posture made the problem worse. His knees were bent, his spine curved, and his head leaned forward slightly to monitor his guns and the small arc of sky visible through the glass. This position placed his skull at the perfect angle for impact. The lack of space prevented him from leaning back safely or adjusting his stance to absorb sudden movement. He could not brace properly because the compartment offered no room to distribute force. The physical environment turned him into a pendulum, with his head as the point most likely to collide with the surfaces around him. The constant vibrations also wore down his ability to react. Hours of shaking dulled the senses, and the mind became slower to process sudden changes. When turbulence arrived unexpectedly, fatigue made it even harder for the gunner to steady himself. This combination of exhaustion and instability created conditions where accidents became almost inevitable. The crew forward rarely understood the severity of these risks. They felt the aircraft tremble, but they did not feel the same violent echo that travelled through the tail. The psychological weight of this danger settled quietly on the gunner. He understood that the aircraft designed to protect him could harm him just as easily. Every mission became a test, not only of endurance but of balance, reflexes, and the ability to anticipate movements impossible to predict. The tail compartment felt less like a station and more like a precarious perch suspended between the engine's power and the wind's violence. It demanded constant physical tension, a readiness to absorb impacts that could come from any direction. Yet maintaining this tension for hours drained the body and mind, leaving him more vulnerable with each passing minute. The fragility of his position deepened the sense of isolation. When the gunner suffered injury from turbulence, the crew might not know until he failed to respond on the intercom. There was no quick way to reach him, no simple method to check on his condition. The same distance that protected the crew from rear attacks also protected them from witnessing the dangers he faced inside the tail. In a space meant for vigilance, the gunner remained vulnerable, not only to enemy fighters, but to the aircraft's own merciless motion. What made this risk most haunting was its unpredictability. Unlike enemy fire, turbulence carried no intention. It arrived without malice, without pattern, without warning. A clear sky could hide a sudden drop. A smooth flight could end in a violent jolt. The gunner learned to accept this unpredictability as part of the environment. It was another reminder that survival depended not on strength alone, but on the delicate balance between the body and the machinery enclosing it. His experience revealed the stark truth that danger came not only from the enemy, but from the aircraft itself. The bomber's structure, though powerful, transmitted forces that the human body was never designed to withstand. Each impact threatened the most vulnerable part of him, turning a simple jolt into a weapon. His fragile position shows how violence could rise from the bomber's own movements, striking without warning and leaving him exposed in ways few outside the tail could understand. Yet even this silent threat was only a portion of what weighed on him, for the fear of abandonment pressed deeper than any sudden jolt. What lingered in the dark moments of damage and confusion would reveal how easily a man could be left behind when survival narrowed to seconds. When damage spread through the frame of a B-17, the chaos that followed forced every crew member to make decisions in moments that barely felt real. The engines could sputter, the wings could tear, or the fuselage could split in ways that escaped the only remaining choice. In those frantic seconds, when smoke filled the compartments and alarms crackled through the intercom, each man moved toward the exits he knew best. But for the tail gunner, there was no such path. His compartment sat at the farthest edge of the aircraft, sealed off by narrow passages and metal bulkheads that could warp or collapse under fire. When the order to abandon the bomber came, if it came at all, he often heard it last, or not at all. The structure of the tail offered no dedicated escape hatch. A gunner wishing to bail out had to crawl forward through the cramped tunnel that connected his station to the main fuselage. Even under perfect conditions, this route demanded time, pushing himself through the confined space, dragging equipment behind him, and navigating curbs shaped by the aircraft's design rather than human need. But damage conditions were never perfect. Fire might block the path, shrapnel could sever it, a structural shift could twist the tunnel into a narrow trap. The gunner's isolation, once merely a psychological burden, now became a physical barrier separating him from survival. When the bomber was struck hard, there were missions where the order to jump came so suddenly that the crew moved without hesitation, each man focused on finding open air before the aircraft lost altitude or broke apart. In that rush, communication faltered. Voices overlapped, static cut through warnings, and the intercom often dissolved into indistinct noise. The forward crew might assume the tail gunner heard the order. They might assume he had started crawling toward them. But assumptions did little to change the reality of distance. The gunner might still be seated at his guns, unaware that the rest of the crew had already begun to leap into the sky. The cruelty of the situation lay not in intentional neglect, but in the design of the aircraft and the speed at which danger unfolded. A bomber spiralling downward gave no one the luxury of coordinated rescue. Parachutes had to be grabbed, exits cleared, and bodies pushed through openings before the aircraft plunged too low for a safe jump. In that frantic sequence, the tail gunner's absence might not even be noticed until the bomber had already been abandoned. The moment the last man jumped, the fate of the gunner left inside was sealed. Reports from surviving crews described these events with a tone somewhere between grief and disbelief. Some recalled seeing the tail section intact when they drifted below the falling bomber, the curved glass still shimmering under the sun as the aircraft descended. Others remembered calling for the gunner and receiving silence, unsure whether he had been killed instantly or simply unable to reach the rest of the crew. There were missions where the wreckage was later found, with the tail compartment crushed inward, the gunner still strapped into position, untouched by the chance at escape the others had taken. The worst cases emerged when the tail section separated during the descent. A violent rupture could send the entire rear of the aircraft plunging on its own, spinning through open air while the gunner remained trapped inside. Without an exit, without a path forward, he had no way to leave the fragment that once belonged to a bomber. These images haunted crew members long after the war, seeing a portion of their aircraft falling alone, taking with it the man who had guarded their backs through every mission. Even on missions where the bomber returned safely, the fear of abandonment lingered in the gunner's thoughts. He understood the fragility of his position more acutely than anyone else aboard. If the aircraft faltered, if flames spread, if structural failure set in, he would be the last to know and the least likely to escape. Every vibration, every sharp creak of metal, every sudden drop in altitude carried the reminder that his survival depended not only on his own actions, but on conditions far beyond his control. This knowledge shaped a quiet anxiety that settled into the core of his experience. The gunner fought not only external threats, but the internal fear that he might never hear the call to jump, that he might remain in the tail as the bomber fell away beneath him. He could imagine the forward crew pushing through the exits, parachutes opening above them, while he struggled in vain against a compartment that offered no path out. The thought was not melodramatic. It was a reality borne out in mission reports and wreckage recovered from fields and seas. The tail gunner's vulnerability to abandonment revealed the harshest truth about his position. He defended the aircraft, yet lacked the means to save himself from it. His courage kept the bomber intact for as long as possible, but when the structure failed, he faced barriers no amount of bravery could overcome. The aircraft demanded loyalty, while offering no guarantee of rescue in return. His risk of being left behind shows how isolation could turn deadly when the bomber faltered under enemy fire. Yet even this fear of entrapment was only one part of the danger he carried, for the equipment meant to shield him from attack offered little real protection. Beneath the thin skin of the tail, another vulnerability waited, to expose the limits of what machinery could defend. Inside the tail compartment, the gunner lived with the uneasy awareness that almost nothing around him was built to keep him alive. The aircraft offered structure, weapons and a place to sit, but little in the way of true protection. The thin metal skin that enclosed the tail was never meant to serve as armor. It existed to give the bomber its shape, to reduce drag, and to support the mounting of the guns. Against enemy fire, it was almost meaningless. Bullets could pierce it with ease, slicing through the compartment as though it were made of paper, leaving the gunner exposed in ways that felt brutally direct. The tail position, designed for vision and maneuverability, sacrificed safety as a matter of necessity. The gunner relied on the small pane of glass in front of him to shield his face from the slipstream and give a narrow field of view. But that glass, curved and thin, offered no real defense against incoming rounds. Enemy fighters approaching from the rear could fire bursts that shattered the window instantly, sending sharp fragments inward and leaving the gunner with nothing but open sky and the rush of freezing air. Even when the glass held, it was never rated to stop armor-piercing ammunition. The moment bullets struck, cracks spread across the surface, distorting visibility and reminding him that the next burst could break through completely. The absence of armor around the gunner's sides and back only worsened the vulnerability. His entire torso, from shoulders to hips, remained exposed to enemy attack. The curved metal behind him, meant to streamline the bomber, formed an ideal surface for absorbing heat and impact from incoming fire. When rounds entered the compartment, they ricocheted unpredictably, spinning and skipping across metal supports and ammunition belts. The gunner had no room to duck, and no safe angle to lean away from the path of the bullets. His position forced him to stay forward, hands on the guns, body aligned directly with the weapon mounts, unable to shield himself. The lack of armor created another problem. The gunner became the natural point of aim for enemy pilots. They understood the bomber's weak spots well. The tail gunner was not just the first line of defense, but also the first target. A skilled fighter could approach from below, rise sharply upward, and unleash a burst directly into the tail, knowing that just a few well-placed rounds could incapacitate or kill the gunner. Once the tail guns fell silent, the bomber became dramatically easier to attack. His survival and the survival of the aircraft were intertwined, yet he was the least protected man aboard. The small weapons station he occupied was fitted with twin .50 caliber machine guns, powerful weapons that gave him the ability to defend the bomber with impressive force. But those guns came with their own dangers. The recoil shook the entire compartment, rattling through his arms and shoulders and echoing off the thin walls. When he fired, the vibration made the structure feel even weaker. He could sense how little material separated him from the outside world. The noise of the guns filled the space, drowning out every other sound and leaving him momentarily unaware of whether the aircraft was being hit. The act of defending himself made the environment feel even more fragile. Even his clothing offered limited protection. The flight suit, layered and insulated for cold, provided warmth but no ballistic defense. The helmet protected only the top of his head and could do nothing against rounds entering from behind or the side. The flak vest, when issued, covered only part of his torso and was designed for shrapnel, not direct fire. Many missions lacked enough vests for every crew member, and the tail gunner, isolated and unseen, was often the one who went without. He entered combat fully aware that his safety depended almost entirely on movement, awareness, and the hope that he could detect threats before they reached him. Inside the tail, every surface became a potential hazard. Ammunition boxes provided no cover. The supports around the gun mounts were too thin to block anything. The narrow space meant he could not shift left or right to avoid an incoming burst. He remained fixed, aligned with the weapons, facing the open sky where threats materialized with terrifying speed. When enemy fighters appeared in the distance, he knew that the exchange between them depended not on armor, but on timing. He simply had to react faster, aim steadier, and hope his rounds reached the target before theirs reached him. This reality shaped much of the tension he carried. Unlike other crew positions, protected by heavier plating or deeper inside the aircraft, he existed at the outer shell of the bomber. The danger felt immediate, unfiltered, and deeply personal. A split-second delay could mean the difference between life and death, and the bomber offered nothing to soften the consequences of a mistake. His lack of protection shows how exposed the tail position truly was, leaving him to fight with little more than skill and hope against the force aimed directly at him. Yet even this vulnerability was only part of the struggle, for the aircraft demanded endurance far beyond the moments of combat. Another burden surfaced once the missions multiplied, turning survival into a test of persistence no man could fully prepare for. For the men who flew aboard B-17 bombers, the simple act of taking off was never routine. Each mission began with a quiet understanding shared among the crew. They might not return. The engines roared with familiar strength, the fuselage vibrated beneath their boots, and the cold morning air wrapped around the aircraft as it taxied across the runway. Yet beneath those ordinary motions lay a brutal truth. The statistics were unforgiving. Completing 25 missions, the official requirement for returning home, felt less like a measure of service and more like a distant dream reserved for the extraordinarily lucky. Survival rates dipped far below what anyone dared speak aloud, leaving every takeoff touched by a sense of finality. Inside the bomber, the tail gunner felt this reality with particular clarity. Isolated in the narrow compartment, he understood the numbers not as abstract calculations, but as shadows that followed every mission. The aircraft lifted into the sky with heavy lethargy, climbing slowly toward altitude, while the landscape shrank beneath the wings. With each ascent, the gunner absorbed the weight of possibility. This flight could be his last. The knowledge settled into his body like cold metal, shaping his breathing and sharpening his awareness. Even before reaching enemy territory, the tension formed a constant pulse within the confined space behind him. The dangerous reputation of bomber missions came from the brutal combination of enemy fighters, flak bursts, mechanical failures, and unpredictable weather. Every sortie exposed the aircraft to dozens of threats, capable of turning a mission into a disaster within seconds. A sudden strike on an engine, a flak shell exploding too close, a fuel leak ignited by tracer fire. Each possibility edged the bomber closer to collapse. For the crew, these dangers accumulated over time. What spared them on one mission might claim them on the next. Probability was an enemy as real as any fighter pilot. The tail gunner felt this accumulation more acutely than most. He knew that his weapon was vital for protecting the bomber, yet he also understood that his isolation placed him at higher risk. When the aircraft entered formation, enemy fighters often tested the defences by attacking from the rear, probing for weaknesses. The gunner, exposed and lightly protected, became the first to engage and the first to absorb the shock of combat. His view of the sky filled with flickers of movement, dark shapes shifting against clouds, streaks of tracer fire cutting through the air. The moments between spotting an attacker and firing upon it contained a sharp recognition. Survival depended on seconds. Despite this constant threat, missions continued day after day. Crews rotated, equipment was repaired, and the machinery of war pressed onward. For many tail gunners, the repetition of these missions created a strange mixture of routine and dread. They strapped into the compartment, knowing that each completed flight brought them one step closer to the coveted number, 25 missions, but also knowing that the odds tilted against them. Some men, due to shortages or extended campaigns, were required to fly 35 missions before earning a return home. The increase, small on paper, represented a staggering rise in risk. Each additional mission stretched the thread of survival thinner. The psychological toll deepened with every flight. The gunner could not ignore the empty spaces in briefing rooms where familiar faces once stood. He noticed how crews returned smaller than they left, how replacement gunners arrived with an uneasy silence, how the war carved jagged gaps through squadrons that once felt whole. The absence of those lost became a constant reminder of the fragile barrier between survival and disappearance. Every man knew someone who had not returned, and every man wondered, quietly, whether his own name would join that list. Yet amid the fear, a strange form of determination emerged. Completing a mission felt like winning a contest against fate itself. The bomber touched down, wheels skidding across the runway, and relief swept through the crew like warm air after winter. The gunner, climbing out of the tail compartment, felt the weight lift from his chest, if only briefly. The loud engines, the cold air, the rattling structure, all became symbols of endurance rather than danger during those fleeting moments on solid ground. Crews cheered quietly, exchanged glances, or simply breathed deeply. They had survived, again. This cycle repeated itself, shaping the rhythm of their lives. Hope rose with each landing, but never fully erased the dread waiting for the next takeoff. The tail gunner learned not to celebrate too loudly, not to assume too much. He marked each mission with a cautious pride, aware that fate made no promises. The mixture of exhaustion, resilience, and hovering fear became part of his character, influencing how he viewed both the sky above him and the ground he longed to return to permanently. The harsh truth behind these missions revealed not just the danger of combat, but the emotional endurance required to carry on. The tail gunner balanced his duty with his fear, knowing that the bomber's safety depended partly on his vigilance. With each completed flight, he moved closer to safety, yet remained trapped in the cycle that demanded he continue flying until the final number was reached. His journey through repeated missions shows how survival rested on a precarious blend of duty, luck, and endurance, each takeoff testing the limits of what a man could bear. Yet even this relentless cycle of risk was only part of his burden, for the cold skies concealed threats that attacked the body in ways no enemy pilot ever could. Beneath that thin layer of survival, another struggle waited to expose the limits of human resilience. High-altitude flight turned the bomber into a moving chamber of cold so intense that it felt less like weather and more like a force capable of reshaping the human body. Inside the tail compartment, the gunner faced temperatures that plunged far below anything experienced on the ground, sinking to levels where breath crystallized instantly and clothing stiffened like thin sheets of metal. The heating system of the aircraft barely reached the forward sections, leaving the rear exposed to the unfiltered wind rushing along the fuselage. In that environment, the gunner's body, pressed against steel supports, gripping frozen metal handles, and surrounded by drafts entering through seams in the structure, became the battleground where cold fought relentlessly against flesh. Fingers felt the first attack. Despite thick gloves designed for extreme altitude, the gunner often needed to remove or loosen them to handle ammunition belts, adjust the guns, or operate equipment requiring precision. The moment bare skin touched metal, the cold seized it like a trap. Contact seemed harmless at first, but within seconds, pain shot through the fingertips as the heat was drawn out with shocking speed. The metal of the gun mounts and handles behaved like ice forged in wind, stealing warmth until skin adhered to its surface. Pulling away meant tearing the skin itself, leaving raw, bleeding patches that froze almost immediately. Ears and noses suffered similar damage. The oxygen mask helped cover part of the face, but it did not protect the delicate extremities that protruded beyond its edges. Frostbite began quietly, with a numbness that spread across the skin as blood retreated deeper into the body. The gunner might not notice the change at first, distracted by the task of scanning the sky or firing at incoming fighters. Only later, when the pain sharpened into burning and then into emptiness, did the truth become clear. The cold had begun its destructive work. Once tissue lost sensation, it became vulnerable to permanent injury. Men returned from missions with ears blackened at the tips or noses blistered and cracked, reminders of how altitude punished even the smallest parts of their bodies. The conditions worsened during long missions. Hours spent in freezing air drained the gunner's ability to move with precision. Muscles stiffened, joints locked, and hands struggled to obey even the simplest commands. The tail position demanded constant readiness, yet the cold dulled the senses until reaction time slowed noticeably. A gunner trying to reload or adjust his aim might find his fingers refusing to bend or his grip slipping at a critical moment. The cold did not kill quickly. It eroded strength gradually, pushing the body toward failure long before the mind recognized the danger. Some of the most disturbing injuries occurred during combat, when the gunner squeezed the triggers of his weapons. The metal under his gloves stiffened to such an extreme degree that it felt more like brittle glass than steel. With the recoil of each shot, the shock traveled down his fingers and into the frozen joints. There were reports of gunners breaking fingers while firing, the cold rendering bones fragile enough to crack under repeated impact. These injuries often went unnoticed during combat because numbness masked the immediate pain. Only after the mission, when the compartment warmed slightly, did the agony reveal itself. Even the clothing designed to protect the men sometimes failed under such brutal conditions. Heated flight suits malfunctioned, wiring froze, and insulation doubled as moisture traps when condensation gathered inside the compartments. Once moisture settled into gloves or boots, it froze solid, encasing the extremities in ice. To remove the gloves was dangerous. To keep them on meant enduring the cold as it seeped deeper into the skin. Some of the most chilling accounts described gunners found after crashes or forced descents. Bodies exposed to the wind stream at altitude could freeze within minutes, locking muscles into rigid poses. When wreckage was recovered, tail gunners were sometimes discovered in positions identical to those they held in their final moments, hands gripping the guns, legs braced against the floor, head tilted toward the shattered glass. Their bodies froze so thoroughly that movement became impossible even after recovery. These scenes left powerful impressions on those who witnessed them, memories carried for decades after the war ended. The cold also attacked the gunners' ability to think clearly. Hypoxia and frostbite formed a dangerous combination. As oxygen levels dropped and body temperature fell, confusion set in, making it difficult to judge distance, track movement, or recognize threats. The gunner, already isolated from the crew, now battled not only the enemy, but his own failing senses. Each mission became a test of endurance that reached far beyond physical discomfort. It became a struggle to remain alert in conditions that numbed every part of him. Despite these dangers, the aircraft pressed onward, and the gunner remained at his post. The cold carved him into a figure of endurance, forcing him to confront a threat that struck without noise, smoke, or warning. His courage showed not only in firing at enemy fighters, but in resisting the atmosphere that sought to break him long before combat began. His battle against the cold shows how altitude claimed the body in ways as devastating as any bullet, freezing flesh and bone until survival became a race against the elements themselves. Yet even this relentless assault from the air was only part of his burden, for the demands placed upon him stretched beyond physical endurance. A hidden weight surfaced in the quiet moments between missions, revealing a struggle that shaped his mind as severely as the cold shaped his body. Training for the tail gunner role often amounted to little more than a brief introduction to the equipment, the aircraft, and the basic mechanics of firing a machine gun. Many of the young men assigned to this position arrived with only a few weeks of preparation, scarcely enough time to understand the complexity of aerial combat, let alone the psychological demands of the job. They stepped into the role not as seasoned soldiers, but as novices thrust into a reality far harsher than any classroom or training field could convey. Their instructors could teach them how to load ammunition and how to track targets, but they could not replicate the chaos of battle or the terror that filled the sky when enemy fighters closed in. The shortness of their training left gaps that only experience could fill, but experience in war came at a cost. The first few missions acted as a brutal initiation, a shock that tightened the throat and stilled the breath. A new gunner, positioned at the very rear of the bomber, quickly learned that the tail compartment was not just another station, but the point where survival hung by the thinnest thread. The sounds of the engines, the vibrations coursing through the frame, and the sudden bursts of flak outside the window formed a language of danger he had never been taught to interpret. In those early moments, he worked not with confidence but with instinct, hoping his hands moved quickly enough to keep pace with threats that seemed to appear from nowhere. The lack of complete understanding extended to formation tactics. Bombers flew in tight groups, relying on overlapping fields of fire to defend against enemy aircraft. But many tail gunners, fresh from abbreviated training programs, did not fully grasp how their actions affected the safety of the entire formation. They might pivot too far to one side, leaving a blind gap behind the bomber. They might fire too early, revealing their position before the enemy commits to an attack. They sometimes focused solely on the aircraft behind them, unaware of how their movements fit into the broader defensive strategy. Without mastery of these group tactics, they were vulnerable, and by extension, so was the bomber they guarded. The psychological unpreparedness ran deeper than the tactical gaps. Training programs seldom addressed the emotional burden of shooting another human being. For many young tail gunners, the first time they aimed their weapons at an enemy fighter was also the first time they confronted the reality that they were expected to kill. The shock of that expectation pressed heavily on them. Even as enemy aircraft approached with lethal intent, the act of pulling the trigger carried a weight that training never explored. Some hesitated in crucial moments, others fired but felt the impact long after the mission ended. The war demanded reflexive action, yet the mind still grappled with the moral confusion that accompanied each engagement. This lack of emotional preparation made the isolation of the tail compartment even harder to bear. Sitting alone at the rear of the aircraft, the gunner had no one to talk to during long flights. There were no instructors correcting mistakes, no senior crew members offering advice in real time. He had to interpret the sky on his own, to distinguish between shadows and threats, to decide when to fire and when to hold back. Even when he performed well, uncertainty lingered. Had he made the right decisions? Or had he endangered the crew by acting too slowly or too quickly? These questions settled into his thoughts, returning between missions like quiet reminders of his inexperience. The emotional strain intensified when he witnessed the consequences of insufficient training. Seeing another bomber in the formation take a direct hit, watching a crewman blown from his station, or hearing the sudden silence on the radio when a familiar voice disappeared. These moments carved themselves into memory. They revealed how little stood between survival and disaster. A gunner might complete dozens of hours of practice, but nothing in his early instruction prepared him for the sight of burning aircraft falling away, or the sound of a wounded comrade calling for help from another compartment. Some gunners adapted quickly, learning what training had failed to cover through the harsh lessons of combat. They developed instincts for reading enemy movements, predicting attack patterns, and timing their shots with precision. But others struggled, weighed down by fear, confusion, and the relentless awareness that they had been sent into battle with too few tools to navigate it. For these men, each mission became a test of endurance rather than skill, survival depending more on luck than on preparation. Yet, despite the gaps in their training, tail gunners continued to take their places on the aircraft, climbing into the narrow compartment with determination shaped by necessity. They learned from the crew around them, listened to advice shared during briefings, and observed how veteran gunners handled the sky. Over time, experience sharpened their instincts, though the cost of that learning often came too late to save those who had struggled the most. His early inexperience shows how men were pushed into combat before they truly understood the demands of the sky, forced to learn through danger rather than guidance. Yet even this struggle to adapt was only one layer of the pressure he carried, for the constant roar and violence of flight created a noise that seeped into the mind long after combat ended. Another burden waited within that relentless sound, shaping him in ways he could not escape. The tail compartment of a B-17 was never silent. From the moment the engines roared to life on the runway until the bomber finally touched down hours later, the gunner lived inside a world built entirely from sound. Noise defined the limits of his reality. It pressed in on him from every side, filling the narrow space with vibrations that shook through metal, bone, and memory. The 4 engines mounted along the wings produced a constant, thunderous growl that settled into the structure of the aircraft like an unending heartbeat. Positioned at the very rear, the tail gunner felt that noise more acutely than anyone else on board. It pulsed through the walls, rattled the glass in front of him, and seeped through every seam in the metal. At high altitude, the engines did not become quieter, only sharper. The thin air allowed sound to travel differently, carrying harsh tones directly into the compartment. The result was a piercing mechanical howl that grew louder when the bomber strained against wind or turbulence. The gunner, sitting inches from the vibrating frame, could feel the engines through the soles of his boots and the back of his spine. The noise never softened, it never paused. It built into a constant pressure that blurred the boundary between hearing and feeling, becoming a physical presence that lived inside the body. Combat multiplied the chaos. When enemy fighters closed in, the steady drone of engines was swallowed by sharper, more violent sounds. Machine guns fired from multiple positions on the bomber, their rapid bursts creating shockwaves that collided in the air. The tail guns, the closest weapons to the gunner, produced a pounding rhythm that reverberated through his arms and chest. Each round fired slammed into the mounts, sending vibrations through his gloves and into his bones. Empty shells rattled across the cramped floor, adding another layer to the clattering storm. Flak explosions brought their own form of terror. When anti-aircraft shells burst nearby, the shockwaves struck the bomber with brutal force. The air filled with the violent crack of detonations, each one close enough to make the structure shudder. The gunner, surrounded by thin metal panels, experienced these detonations as if they were happening inside the compartment. The wall behind him flexed under the impact, cables trembled above his head, and the glass in front of him vibrated violently. Even when the bomber was not directly hit, the sound of flak alone was enough to make the heart lurch. Inside the confined space, these noises had no room to dissipate. Every sound, engine rumble, gunfire, wind tearing past the fuselage, metal twisting under strain, bounced off the curved interior and returned amplified. The gunner's helmet provided minimal protection. It softened only the highest frequencies, leaving the deeper vibrations free to carve their way into his ears. During long missions, the noise became so overwhelming that thoughts fractured into fragments, scattered between bursts of sound. Communication became a struggle. The intercom offered a lifeline to the rest of the crew, but even that system faltered under the weight of the surrounding noise. Static crackled constantly. Voices came through distorted, broken into syllables by interference. Sometimes the gunner heard only fragments, warnings, instructions, or calls for help reduced to incomprehensible noise. At other times, the intercom fell silent entirely, leaving him alone with the roar of engines and the pounding of guns. In that isolation, sound became both companion and tormentor. The physical consequences built silently over time. Many tail gunners developed ringing in their ears, an incessant hum that followed them long after the engines quieted. Others experienced sharp stabbing pains from damaged eardrums, or a gradual muffling of sound as hearing diminished. Temporary deafness after missions became common, a period where voices felt distant and indistinct, swallowed by the lingering memory of the aircraft's roar. Some men recovered partially, others never did. But the psychological toll often reached deeper than the physical damage. The constant noise created a state of heightened tension that never truly faded. Even when the bomber flew smoothly, the gunner remained braced for the next explosion, the next sudden shift, the next burst of gunfire. His body lived in a cycle of anticipation, waiting for danger to announce itself through sound. After the war, many gunners described hearing echoes of those missions, phantom engines rumbling in quiet rooms, imagined gunfire crackling in the back of their minds, the tremor of flak bursting behind closed eyelids. The noise shaped their memories of service. The roar of engines became synonymous with fear, duty, and endurance. Silence, when it finally came after landing, felt foreign, too soft, too fragile, a reminder of how deeply the tail gunner had lived inside a world where quiet did not exist. Even moments of rest carried traces of the sky, a ringing ear, a vibrating jaw, a hum lodged somewhere deep inside the chest. This unending assault on the senses revealed another layer of the tail gunner's burden. Survival depended not just on skill or vigilance, but on the ability to remain steady inside a storm of sound that never ceased, never relented, and never allowed the mind to fully settle. His endurance became a measure not only of physical toughness, but of psychological resilience, tested every hour he spent in the air. His struggle against the relentless noise shows how sound itself became a weapon, striking with a force that lingered long after the mission ended. Yet even this constant barrage was only part of his experience, for the shadows left behind by each flight reached far beyond the physical strain. What emerged in the quiet moments after battle revealed how deeply those hours in the sky shaped the thoughts he carried with him. Among all the crew positions aboard a B-17, the tail gunner carried a burden that few fully recognized. He watched the bomber's rear, guarded the direction from which the deadliest attacks often came, and endured isolation unmatched by any other role. Yet when the mission ended, and the aircraft rolled to a stop in the runway, his contributions faded quietly into the background. The spotlight fell on the pilots, the bombardier, or the crew chief, men whose duties were more visible, more easily understood, and more frequently recorded. The tail gunner, climbing out of his cramped compartment long after the others had already touched the ground, slipped back into a world where recognition seldom reached him. There were no special medals given exclusively for the work he performed. No ribbons are designed to honour the long hours spent in the coldest, most exposed part of the bomber. His courage looked different from that of other airmen, and because it lacked dramatic ceremony, it went unnoticed. The danger he faced was constant, yet quiet, hidden in the rear of the aircraft where few could observe it. His heroism did not involve dramatic dives or split-second bomb releases. Instead, it consisted of scanning empty sky for hours, bracing against turbulence, firing at targets that moved faster than thought, and protecting the rest of the crew without expecting thanks. Even historical records preserved this absence. Documents detailing missions often focused on bomb runs, enemy losses, or damage sustained by the aircraft. Rarely did they describe the tail gunner's actions unless something catastrophic occurred. His performance was usually reduced to a line or two in mission summaries, if mentioned at all. Diaries and memoirs written after the war centered on pilots' experiences or navigators' pressures, leaving the gunner's world behind in fragments of memory. What he endured remained largely unspoken, overshadowed by narratives that felt easier to tell. Inside the bomber, the tail gunner felt this invisibility keenly. Before missions, he sat apart from the crew while performing his equipment checks, far from the shared conversations that helped others prepare. During the flight, he spoke only when necessary, his voice carried through the intercom in short, functional messages. After landing, he often climbed down from the aircraft alone, unnoticed by those who gathered around the cockpit to congratulate the pilots or inspect the front guns. This pattern repeated itself day after day, until the sense of being peripheral became part of his identity. The emotional toll of this invisibility grew heavier as missions accumulated. Each flight required an immense amount of focus, tension, and resilience, yet these sacrifices rarely received acknowledgement. When the crew survived a dangerous encounter, the collective relief was real, but the gunner's part in that survival often went quietly unmentioned. The others might nod in appreciation or offer a brief word, but the depth of his role, its isolation, danger, and responsibility, remained unseen. He contributed to the bomber's return without having a space in which his efforts could fully register. This lack of recognition shaped the way the war lived inside him. He knew that the mission depended partly on his eyes, his reflexes, and his endurance. Yet he also knew that history might forget him. Even in moments of triumph, when a mission succeeded or a formation returned intact, he felt a distance between himself and the celebration. The bomber's safety came from teamwork, but not all parts of the team were acknowledged equally. Hidden at the very end of the aircraft, he worked without expecting praise and without receiving it. As the war progressed, the number of fallen airmen grew. Memorials were formed, ceremonies held, and names preserved in long lists. But tail gunners, whose deaths often occurred silently in the rear of the aircraft, or who disappeared entirely with the tail section during crashes, were sometimes left unidentified. Their final acts, firing until the end, holding their position even as the bomber failed, rarely made their way into public accounts. Families received telegrams with sparse details, unaware of the full measure of bravery that defined their loved ones' last moments. Even after returning home, many tail gunners struggled to explain their experiences. The role was difficult to describe and easily misunderstood by those who had never seen the inside of a bomber. Stories of isolation and unending vigilance felt foreign to civilians, and attempts to share them were often met with polite confusion. Over time, silence replaced conversation. The gunner carried his memories privately, adding another layer to the invisibility that had begun during the war. This quiet erasure did not diminish his importance, but it shaped the way he moved through the world. His contribution had been essential, yet it remained unnoticed by most. Within the machinery of war, his role became a paradox, vital yet overlooked, dangerous yet uncelebrated, defining yet invisible. The war left marks on him that no ceremony could fully acknowledge, even if such ceremonies had existed. His quiet disappearance from recognition shows how easily sacrifice can fade when lived at the edges of the spotlight, leaving his courage recorded only in the memories of those who truly understood the sky. Yet even this sense of being unseen was not the last burden he carried, for the flames that sometimes swallowed the bomber revealed a far more terrifying fate. What waited inside those fires exposed the final vulnerability of the man who guarded the rear. Fire was the terror every airman feared, but few truly understood until it happened. Inside a B-17, flames behaved differently than on the ground. They spread with the violence of wind, fed by fuel, oxygen lines, hydraulic fluids, and the constant rush of air tearing along the fuselage. When a bomber caught fire, the blaze did not simply consume, it exploded into being, racing through compartments with terrifying speed. For the tail gunner, isolated at the very end of the aircraft, the danger took a form more haunting than for any other crew member. Flames ignited far ahead of him, often starting in the wings or bomb bay, and only reached the tail after devastating everything in their path. That delay meant he had time to understand what was coming, yet no way to escape it. The fire could begin with a single tracer round piercing the fuel tank, or a shard of flak ripping into an oxygen line. Within seconds, a burst of flame erupted, carried backward by the slipstream. Smoke filled the midsection of the aircraft before drifting toward the rear, curling through seams and openings in the fuselage. The gunner smelled it before he saw it, a bitter, metallic scent that clung to the inside of the oxygen mask and warned him that the bomber's interior had begun to burn. He might call out to the crew, his voice sharp over the intercom, but their replies often came through clouded with fear and static. As the fire worsened, the bomber's structure reacted violently. Heat-warped metal panels caused them to bend inward or buckle under pressure. The vibrations of flight amplified the distortion, making the tail shudder with growing instability. The gunner could feel each change through the thin walls that surrounded him, the tremors running through the floor and into the mount of his weapons. He understood what these sensations meant. The flames were advancing. They would reach him eventually, and he had almost no room to move, no hatch to open, no path to crawl through once the midsection filled with smoke and debris. In front of the aircraft, other crew members sometimes jumped while there was still time. The pilots, bombardiers and waist gunners had paths to the exits, narrow and chaotic but still possible. The tail gunner did not share those options. The tunnel connecting his compartment to the rest of the aircraft was too small to navigate quickly during an emergency, especially when smoke poured through it and pieces of burning insulation fell from above. Even if he attempted to crawl forward, the flames often overtook the central fuselage first, sealing off the space with unbearable heat. He remained trapped at the end of the bomber, watching the glow brighten behind him. Fire brought more than heat. It brought suffocation. The gunner relied on his oxygen mask to breathe at altitude, but smoke seeped into the lines, filling them with fumes. The mixture made each breath sharp and painful. If the oxygen system ruptured, a common result of fire, small explosions rattled through the aircraft, sending burning fragments toward the tail. The compartment grew hotter, the metal beneath his gloves warming until it scorched through the layers of fabric. The cold that had plagued him through every mission vanished, replaced by an intensity of heat unbearable to imagine inside a space designed for freezing air. Some gunners continued firing even as flames approached, determined to protect the bomber as long as possible. Their last transmissions over the intercom often carried no fear, only urgency, focus, and a voice strained by smoke. But once the fire reached the tail, there was nothing left to fight. The heat consumed the oxygen around him, the metal behind him weakened, and the glass in front of him cracked under temperature shifts. He had no way out. In these moments, the others in the crew heard only silence. They might see the tail engulfed in flames as they descended under parachute, the glow swallowing the compartment where their comrade remained. Recovery teams sometimes found the wreckage of burned aircraft long after they crashed. In several cases, the tail section was discovered intact enough to reveal the gunner, still in place, body frozen in the final position he held, a stark reminder of how completely the compartment had trapped him. Flames stole the chance of escape, leaving behind only the echo of his presence inside the twisted metal. These scenes haunted the men who witnessed them, their memories marked by the realization that the gunner had met his end alone, beyond the reach of help, with the aircraft he had defended until the last moment. For those who survived the war, the fear of fire lingered in their thoughts. They remembered missions where smoke filled the sky, where bombers burned in mid-air and fell in arcs of bright flame. They remembered watching the tail disappear in fire before the bomber broke apart. They remembered the helplessness of knowing one of their own was still trapped at the rear. This fear, born from countless missions, settled deep in the consciousness of every tail gunner. It became a silent companion on each flight, a possibility that hovered behind every successful mission and every safe landing. Fire revealed the final vulnerability of the tail gunner's position. It showed how the structure that protected him from the cold and supported his guns could also become a prison when the bomber burned. No amount of training or strength could overcome the lack of escape. He faced the flames with the same resolve he brought to combat, yet the aircraft offered no mercy and no path to survival. His fate inside a burning aircraft shows how the bomber that carried him could also become the force that sealed his end, trapping him in the very compartment he defended. Yet even this terrifying possibility formed only part of the danger he lived with, for the skies hid another threat that revealed itself when mission seemed nearly won. In those final stretches toward home, a cruel pattern emerged that placed him once more in the crosshairs. The return journey, which should have offered a sense of relief, often presented one of the most dangerous phases of the mission for the tail gunner. After bombs were dropped and formations began to break apart, the bomber's defenses loosened, its structure weakened, and its crew was exhausted from hours of vigilance. Enemy fighters knew this. They watched the formation shift and thin out, searching for aircraft that lagged even slightly behind. When a bomber turned toward home, the tail became the most exposed point, the first to be seen, the easiest to track, and the least protected. In those moments, the gunner found himself transformed into the primary mark for pilots determined to claim one last kill before disengaging. The bomber's retreat created predictable movement in the sky. As the aircraft shifted from attack paths to return courses, its rear section faced directly toward the enemy's approach. Skilled fighter pilots exploited this angle with ruthless precision. They dove from above or climbed from below, aligning themselves with the narrow silhouette of the tail, where the gunner sat like a solitary sentinel. His guns offered a fierce defense, but the compartment around him remained thin and fragile. The slightest deviation in aim, the smallest hesitation, or the briefest burst of fatigue could tip the balance toward disaster. During this phase of flight, the gunner often fought alone. The forward guns no longer faced the incoming threat. The side gunners might be reloading or dealing with their own injuries, and the pilot was focused on stabilizing the aircraft after the bombing run. The tail gunner, strapped into his exposed position, bore the responsibility of defending the bomber's retreat. He scanned the shrinking sky for glimmers of approaching fighters, knowing that the enemy could appear suddenly from the glare of the sun or the haze of distant clouds. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, triggered a surge of adrenaline. Survival depended on reacting faster than fatigue allowed. Fatigue posed a formidable threat at this stage of the mission. Hours spent in freezing temperatures, distorted by noise, constrained by the tight compartment, and pressured by constant vigilance left the gunner physically depleted. His fingers might be numb, his eyes strained, and his breathing shallow from prolonged tension. When the enemy attacked during the return, he was already frayed, yet combat demanded precision as sharp as when the mission began. The mismatch between his condition and the danger he faced revealed a harsh truth. Returning home required as much resilience as reaching the target. Enemy pilots understood the mental and physical exhaustion that plagued bomber crews. They used timing to their advantage, launching surprise attacks when discipline faltered. Some circled the formation from a distance, waiting until bombers approached the edge of their defensive zones before striking. Others chased individual aircraft that fell behind the group due to engine trouble or damage from flak. The tail gunner in these isolated bombers faced relentless pursuit, firing at fighters that darted in and out of the clouds, their attacks synchronized with the bombers' moments of weakness. The approach to friendly territory did not guarantee safety. Even when the coastline appeared beneath the wings or familiar landmarks came into view, the danger persisted. Fighters often followed bombers all the way back, hoping to strike before the aircraft reached protected airspace. In these closing minutes, the tail gunner's role intensified. He defended the aircraft as the ground neared, his muscles trembling from exhaustion, his eyes burning from cold and strain. The cruel irony lay in the timing. After surviving the bombing run and the formation's battles, he could still fall victim to an attack delivered within sight of home. Some gunners described being hit mere miles from the airfield, wounded by the last burst of enemy fire before the fighter turned away. Others recalled aircraft limping back with damaged tails, their gunner unconscious or severely injured after holding off attackers until the final stretch. There were missions where the bomber touched down safely, only for the crew to discover that the tail gunner had died moments before landing, still strapped into his position, body tilted forward over silent guns. His death came after the danger seemed to have passed, a stark reminder of how fragile survival remained, even at the mission's end. The intensity of these return attacks left marks that lingered long after the war. Tail gunners remembered the feeling of being hunted, the sense that escape was always one step behind them. They carried the memory of those final, desperate minutes, the roar of engines, the flash of tracer fire streaking toward them, the trembling of the aircraft as it struggled to stay airborne. The near misses, the sudden jolts of bullets striking the fuselage, and the knowledge that a few inches could have changed their fate, carved deep impressions into their thoughts. This vulnerability during the retreat revealed one more truth about the tail gunner's role. Danger was not evenly distributed across the mission. It concentrated at the moments when survival seemed within reach, appearing suddenly to remind him that the sky offered no mercy. The retreat required strength not only to fire accurately, but to endure the crushing realization that survival could be snatched away at the last possible moment. His battles during the retreat show how survival could unravel in the final stretch, turning the journey home into yet another fight against skilled hunters, determined to strike before safety returned. Yet even this peril from the sky formed only part of the pressure he carried, for the deepest harm often emerged quietly within his own mind. Beneath the roar of engines, a different struggle took shape, one that no amount of training or courage could completely silence. The psychological strain placed upon a tail gunner formed a quiet, relentless burden that settled into place long before the aircraft ever left the runway. Unlike other crew members who worked shoulder to shoulder, shared glances, exchanged gestures, or felt the presence of teammates nearby, the gunner operated inside a small sphere of isolation. Once the engines roared to life and the aircraft lifted into the cold air, he was sealed off from the rest of the bomber, surrounded by vibrating metal, shuddering glass, and an expanse of sky that reminded him constantly of his aloneness. The intercom carried voices, but they arrived distorted and distant, never easing the sense that he was separated, not just physically, but emotionally, from the crew he fought beside. In this narrow compartment, the gunner had no one to speak to, no chance to share a word that might steady trembling nerves, and no ability to look another person in the eye for reassurance. The view around him consisted only of shifting clouds, gleaming contrails, and the faint silhouettes of enemy fighters searching for an angle of attack. The longer he spent in this space, the more the isolation became a presence of its own. The confined posture he had to maintain, the cold that crept into his bones, and the constant mechanical vibration combined to amplify a deep internal loneliness that few other positions on the bomber ever experienced. This loneliness was not merely discomfort, it shaped the gunner's understanding of his place in the machine of war. He knew that he would be the first to see the enemy, the first to open fire, and often the first to die. The realization grew heavy with each mission. While other crew positions shared overlapping responsibilities, the tail gunner's task stood apart. He alone was the final shield protecting the aircraft's vulnerable rear. If he faltered, even for a moment, the bomber could fall within seconds. The weight of this knowledge pressed into his thoughts every time he lowered himself into the cramped enclosure and locked his harness in place. As missions accumulated, the psychological load deepened. Memories of close calls, of tracers slicing past the glass, of shells detonating nearby, and of flames erupting from aircraft in the distance, built layer upon layer. He could not easily release these images, as they replayed in the isolation of his compartment, with no distraction to soften them. The absence of conversation, the lack of a visible human presence, and the endless horizon outside the turret intensified the internal echo of fear. Even when no fighters approached, the possibility was always there, hovering like a shadow over every breath. Night missions worsened this burden. Darkness erased the horizon, leaving only the faint light of the moon or the sporadic flicker of flak below. Without visual anchors, the sense of isolation magnified until it seemed as if the bomber moved through a void where danger could appear without warning. The tail gunner sat alone with this awareness, gripping the handles of his guns, forcing himself to remain vigilant even when his body begged for rest. The strain of this vigilance accumulated silently, tightening muscles, sharpening anxiety, and draining emotional reserves that were already thin. Even after landing, the gunner found little relief. Crew debriefings focused on tactics, damage, and mission results, not on emotional well-being. There was no language to describe the internal strain that built up during hours of silence at the back of the aircraft. Many gunners kept their experiences to themselves, believing that others might not understand, or that expressing fear would be seen as weakness. This silence followed them into the barracks, into the next briefing, and back into the turret when the next mission began. Over time, the accumulation of fear, isolation, and responsibility etched itself into their minds. Some experienced difficulty sleeping, their dreams filled with images of incoming fighters or glass shattering under enemy fire. Others felt constantly on edge, their nerves conditioned to expect sudden danger. The isolation they endured during missions did not leave easily. It lingered, shaping their reactions long after the aircraft touched down. When the war finally ended, many tail gunners carried invisible scars that did not fade with the end of combat. The psychological strain they endured had few outlets in civilian life, where their position was often overlooked or poorly understood. They returned home to quiet towns, factory jobs, or farms, but the silence of the turret followed them. Sudden noises sparked panic. Crowded rooms felt suffocating. Sleep brought nightmares that repeated the moments when death felt inches away. The lack of recognition for their role only deepened these wounds, making them feel as though their suffering had vanished into history without acknowledgement. For some, post-traumatic stress became a defining part of their post-war lives. They struggled to describe the depth of their fear or the isolation of their duty, and many had no access to support systems that might have helped them heal. The psychological burden they carried had accumulated slowly, invisibly, across dozens of missions, and now it settled into the corners of their lives where it remained unspoken. The war had ended, but their minds stayed locked inside the turret, listening for footsteps of danger that no longer approached. It becomes clear that the weight carried in that narrow compartment is not only metal and ammunition, but a quiet terror that slowly reshapes the mind. It leads naturally toward the darker truth of how judgment can falter under strain. A revelation is waiting in the following account, one that exposes how even the smallest hesitation could unleash irreversible tragedy. There were moments inside the tail of a B-17 when panic rose faster than breathing could keep up, and the gunner had to accept that fear made the mind less precise than the machinery surrounding him. The cold, the shaking metal, and the crushing sense of isolation combined into a raw environment where decisions had to be made in fragments of seconds, and those fragments were rarely gentle. It was inside this pressure chamber of noise, vibration, and dread that mistakes happened, not because the gunner was reckless, but because the human body was never designed to operate in a place where survival depended on instincts sharpened beyond their natural limits. The tail gunner watched the world through a narrow piece of glass that distorted perspective, distance, and movement, and the slightest misinterpretation could turn a defensive response into a fatal error. The sky behind a bomber formation was a shifting canvas of shapes and shadows that blended too easily with the silhouettes of friendly aircraft, and no amount of training could slow the speed at which an incoming threat seemed to appear. The anxiety was magnified by how quickly the mind had to register danger, and the gunner rarely had the luxury of analysing what he was looking at. He had to respond before the enemy fired, and that demand crushed the separation between caution and urgency. There were times when the pressure to protect the aircraft created a narrow focus that erased the broader picture, a phenomenon so common that many crews understood it as an unavoidable reality. Friendly planes moving in irregular patterns or adjusting formation heights could drift into the gunner's line of sight at the worst possible moment, creating confusion that lasted only a heartbeat, yet carried devastating consequences. The gunner could not stop the shaking in his hands or the racing in his chest when the aircraft suddenly jolted, and in those moments, the instinct to fire overshadowed careful identification. The conditions outside only worsened the likelihood of mistakes. The bitter cold blurred vision, the stiffening of fingers slowed reaction times, and the oxygen mask created an uneven rhythm of breath that sometimes heightened dizziness. Turbulence or evasive maneuvering distorted the view even more, making distant objects appear closer than they were, or disguising them entirely. It was not unusual for a friendly aircraft to pass behind clouds, ice crystals, or the glint of sunlight reflecting off metal, each one capable of disguising its true identity for a moment too long. The gunner knew that hesitation could lead to disaster, but he also knew that haste could be just as deadly, and that impossible balance was one of the defining struggles of his position. The mental burden grew heavier with each mission. After experiencing near misses or witnessing collisions within the formation, the gunner's mind became even more sensitive to threats that might not have existed. He carried the memory of previous attacks, the sudden appearance of enemy fighters, and the sound of rounds striking metal, all of which influenced his reactions before he could fully process them. There was no clear moment of rest when emotion could reset. The missions were too frequent, the tension too constant, and the fear too persistent. Over time, the rapid decision-making that the role required evolved into a reflex, driven more by survival than by certainty, and that reflex sometimes directed fire toward aircraft that did not deserve it. Some gunners lived with the weight of having accidentally fired at friendly planes, and although the incidents were often unintentional, the guilt became another layer of burden inside an already overwhelming job. Misidentification happened so quickly that some gunners did not even realize what they had fired upon until the radio confirmed damage or screamed warnings, and by then the event had already passed beyond correction. The isolation of the tail position meant that no one else could validate the gunner's perception, and he had no immediate reassurance that he had been right or wrong. Inside that loneliness, the mind replayed each encounter repeatedly, searching for clarity that never fully came. The physical environment offered no comfort after such mistakes. The cold metal walls forced the gunner to sit alone with his thoughts, and the continuous drone of engines made reflection feel even heavier. The gunner endured the rest of the flight with the knowledge that misjudgment could have endangered the crew he was trying to protect, and that contradiction cut deeply into his sense of purpose. Even when the aircraft landed safely, the memory remained sharp, and the possibility of repeating the mistake stayed with him long after the mission ended. The next time he aimed into the shifting sky behind the bomber, doubt lingered at the edge of his vision, reminding him that the enemy was not the only danger he had to avoid. Friendly fire was rarely discussed openly, because those who experienced it feared the judgment of their comrades, and in many cases the details remained unspoken. Yet it was an undeniable part of life for tail gunners, a reality shaped by urgency, chaos, and human limits pushed far beyond their breaking points. It was one more danger hidden within a role already defined by isolation, cold, and constant threat, and it added a psychological wound that few would ever fully understand. It becomes evident that the strain inside the gun compartment could distort judgment as easily as it exhausts the body. It guides attention toward the fragile state a wounded gunner had to endure when assistance was far beyond reach. What waits just ahead reaches deeper into how pain and isolation shapes their fight to stay alive. The moment injury struck inside the tail compartment, survival became an ordeal shaped by distance, silence, and the brutal truth that no one could reach him in time. The narrow space that already pressed against his body now felt even smaller, tightening with every breath as pain spread through limbs that had no room to stretch or curl for relief. Blood moved in slow, unsteady pulses, soaking into layers of cold fabric, while the aircraft shook violently from turbulence, gunfire, and engine vibration that never stopped long enough for him to gather strength. There was no medic waiting behind a curtain, no hand reaching forward to steady him, no voice asking where it hurt. High above the earth, surrounded by metal, glass, and air so thin it stole warmth from the skin, the wounded gunner faced his injury alone. The tail position had always been physically isolating, but once a bullet or shard of metal ripped through the compartment, that isolation hardened into something far more unforgiving. The intercom might crackle with distant voices, yet those voices belonged to men who could not crawl back to him, even if they wanted to. The narrow tube of the fuselage prevented anyone from reaching the tail, and even if they attempted it, gunfire and freezing temperatures made movement nearly impossible. The wounded gunner knew this. He knew before every mission that if a round tore through his leg or shoulder, there would be no bandages pressed against the wound, no morphine, no reassurance that help was on the way. There was only him, the gun mount, and the cold metal walls that witnessed everything, yet offered nothing. Pain behaved differently in the air. It sharpened in the cold, stiffened as heat drained from exposed skin, and pulsed violently each time the bomber changed altitude. The thin oxygen made breathing shallow, which slowed blood flow but also fogged the mind, blurring thoughts that were already fragile under the stress of combat. A wound that might have been survivable on the ground could become lethal within minutes when trapped inside the tail. Blood couldn't clot well in sub-zero temperatures, and the vibrations of the aircraft prevented the body from staying still long enough to slow the bleeding. Every second became a negotiation with consciousness, a quiet struggle not to slip into the kind of darkness that no one returned from. Some gunners tried to improvise. They pressed gloves, scarves, or even pieces of flight gear against open wounds, hoping the pressure would buy a few more minutes. Others attempted to tighten belts or straps around limbs to stop bleeding, but the thick gloves required for the cold made such tasks nearly impossible. A few tried to keep firing even while wounded, refusing to abandon their duty while enemy fighters circled behind the bomber like predators waiting for weakness. That decision often led to more blood loss, more shock, and a sharper drop in body temperature that pushed them toward unconsciousness. The fight to stay awake became as important as the fight to stay alive. The physical distance between the tail and the rest of the aircraft created a different kind of wound, one that couldn't be seen from outside. The injured gunner could hear chatter on the intercom, could hear decisions being made, could hear engines roaring and metal rattling, yet none of those sounds acknowledged the depth of his suffering. Sometimes he cried out, hoping the pilot or radio operator would hear the strain in his voice, but there was little they could do besides urge him to hold on. The truth was painful. Help was hundreds of miles away, waiting only once the bomber reached its base. And the bomber still had to survive enemy fire, flak bursts, and mechanical failures before that landing could happen. Many lasted the entire trip home, only by surrendering themselves to a kind of mental stillness, focusing on breath, on the rhythm of vibration, on the faint warmth trapped inside their gloves. They clung to consciousness through force of will. Yet even those who reached the runway alive often did so in near-freezing rigour, slumped in the cramped space with blood crystallized on clothing and limbs too numb to move. Crewmen who opened the compartment sometimes found the wounded gunner curled awkwardly in the same posture he had held for hours, unable to speak, shivering violently, but alive through sheer endurance. Others were not so fortunate, their bodies preserved by cold long after their pulse had faded. The cruelty of these moments lingered long after missions ended. Surviving such injuries left deep marks, phantom cold in the bones, memory flashes of loneliness, sudden jolts of fear in tight spaces. The men learned that even when surrounded by crewmates who trusted them, a wound received in the tail remained theirs alone to endure. The war demanded everything from them, and the bomber's design ensured that much of that sacrifice would happen in silence. It becomes clear that survival in the tail often depended less on medical care than on endurance that pushed the limits of the human body. It directs attention toward the moments when fear overwhelmed even the strongest gunners, reshaping how they reacted under fire. Hidden within that struggle is an account that reveals how hesitation and terror sometimes turned against their own side. Fear inside the tail compartment did not always arrive in a sudden burst. Sometimes it settled slowly, tightening its grip until movement itself became impossible. The position demanded constant vigilance, yet the mind could only endure so much before instinct shifted from fighting back to shutting down. For some gunners, the moment enemy fighters appeared behind the bomber, their hands stiffened on the controls, their breath shortened, and the world narrowed to a haze of sound and vibration. They remained conscious and aware, but their bodies refused to obey commands. Every muscle felt locked in place, trembling yet unmoving, as though the cold metal surrounding them had fused with their limbs. This paralysis did not come from weakness. It came from overload, the culmination of noise, tension, isolation, and the knowledge that death could reach them before they even squeezed the trigger. The tail was already a space of confinement, and fear magnified that confinement until it felt impossible to look away from the approaching danger. Gunners who froze described a sensation like floating outside their own bodies, watching themselves fail to react while alarms and gunfire erupted around them. Their vision tunneled, their hearing sharpened and distorted at the same time. The intercom might carry frantic voices calling out threats, but to the frozen gunner, those words sounded distant, muffled, as if spoken through a heavy layer of fog. Their thoughts repeated in loops, commands like move, aim, lift your hands, but their muscles refused to cooperate. In those critical seconds, the aircraft flew on, the enemy pressed in, and the gunner remained suspended between awareness and action. This paralysis could strike without warning. Some men flew dozens of missions before experiencing it. Others felt it early, even during training flights when everything was calm and controlled. The mind carried the accumulation of every close call, every burst of flak, every scream of metal as rounds struck the fuselage. Over time, these memories layered on top of each other until the body reacted not with decisive movement, but with a quiet collapse into stillness. The gunner understood the stakes. He understood his responsibility. Yet fear, when it reached its breaking point, acted with the force of a physical blow, seizing control of the nervous system and overriding intention. The consequences could be devastating. An unresponsive gunner left the rear of the bomber exposed, giving enemy fighters the perfect angle to fire without resistance. Other crew members might not realize what was happening until too late. They heard no warning call, saw no tracer rounds from the tail, and by the time they understood that silence meant paralysis rather than safety, the aircraft might already be under heavy attack. Some gunners were found after landing, still gripping their weapons, fingers locked around the handles, eyes red and unfocused. When asked what happened, they struggled to explain. Their memories were fragmented, a blur of shadows, noise, and a final, overwhelming surge of helplessness. This fear was not the dramatic panic often imagined in war stories. It was quiet, creeping, and deeply internal. Many gunners hid it well, determined not to appear weak in front of their crew. They kept flying even when their hands shook during pre-flight checks, or their stomach tightened before takeoff. Yet no amount of determination could fully guard against moments when the brain simply shut down in self-preservation. Psychologists would later call this freeze response, an instinct older than language, triggered when the mind no longer believed escape or fight was possible. In the war, it was rarely discussed. There was no space for confession. The expectation was simple: perform your duty or others may die. For some, the paralysis lasted only seconds, enough for a burst of fear to pass so they could force themselves into action. For others, it lasted the entire engagement. In the worst cases, gunners completed entire missions without firing a single round. Enemy fighters approached, circled, attacked, and vanished again while the tail gunner sat rigid, unable to help himself or the crew. Reports of such incidents spread quietly, usually mentioned only in debriefings, or whispered among airmen who feared they might someday experience the same fate. No punishment awaited these men. The officers understood that war affected each mind differently, but understanding did not erase the shame that many carried long after the war ended. Even after returning home, the memory of freezing under fire haunted them. Some avoided tight spaces for the rest of their lives. Others reacted strongly to sudden noises. They remembered, not the enemy fighter itself, but the moment their body refused to move, the moment they felt suspended between life and death, with no control over their own survival. That stillness, born of terror, left an imprint deeper than physical wounds. They had confronted not only the enemy, but their own limits, limits that revealed themselves at the most unforgiving moments. Fear in the tail position was not a failure of courage, it was the human mind reaching the boundary of what it could endure. The war demanded constant readiness, constant action, constant control, yet the body sometimes rebelled, refusing commands, even when the stakes were highest. In that narrow compartment, surrounded by glass and steel and miles of empty sky, a gunner could face an enemy far more relentless than gunfire, the silent collapse of his own strength. This struggle shows how terror could take hold even in men who had survived countless missions, shaping their actions without warning. It suggests a deeper look into those whose identities disappeared in the chaos, leaving only unanswered questions for grieving families. Hidden within that loss lies an account of sacrifice that faded without recognition. Loss in wartime often carried a shape that could be measured, touched, or identified. Yet for many B-17 tail gunners, their disappearance left nothing behind, except a void that families were forced to interpret on their own. A gunner stationed in the rear compartment occupied the most fragile point of the aircraft, a section that could detach, collapse, or disintegrate under fire with terrifying speed. When a bomber shuddered under a burst of cannon fire or flak, the tail was frequently the first section to fail. In those moments, the man inside vanished into the sky before his own crew realized what had happened. Silence on the intercom might be mistaken for static, for a frozen microphone, or for simple radio failure. Only later, often after landing, did the crew discover that their gunner had been torn away into the vastness below. Recovering the remains of such men was nearly impossible. Missions spanned oceans, mountains, forests, and enemy territory where Allied search efforts could not safely reach. A tail section that separated from the aircraft usually plummeted at high speed, breaking apart in mid-air or smashing into terrain too remote to locate. Impact with water erased all traces, fire consumed identification. Even in rare instances when wreckage was found, the destruction was so total that names could not be restored to bodies. Families received no burial, no ashes, no last possession to hold. All they had was a letter declaring their loved one missing, later amended to presumed dead. For relatives, this vague finality created a grief that never truly settled. Mothers left a coat hanging by the door, hoping their sons might miraculously return. Wives avoided moving furniture, unwilling to disturb the ghost of a life paused in mid-step. Some families believed their missing gunners had survived the fall, imagining them stranded, recovering, or held as prisoners. That sliver of hope kept mourning restrained, stretching sorrow into something long, thin, and unbearably quiet. Without a grave to visit, pain remained unanchored. Every unanswered question echoed inside the home long after the war ended. Military records treated these disappearances as statistical inevitabilities. Bombers vanished on missions with no witnesses, no distress calls, and no survivors. A gunner whose compartment detached mid-air left no account of his final moments, and therefore his story ended abruptly in the logs. Paperwork marked him as missing. Months later, another paper shifted the designation to dead. There was no ceremony for those whose bodies could not be identified. Their names blended into long lists carved into memorial walls, distant from the families who once shaped their daily lives. For airmen still flying, the knowledge of how often gunners disappeared without a trace formed an unspoken fear. Each mission forced them to face the possibility of erasure, not simply death, but removal from the world so complete that no one would ever know their final thoughts, final breaths, or final cry for help. The rear of the bomber was a space of courage, but it was also a space where anonymity swallowed identity. Men who fought fiercely, who protected their crews with unwavering dedication, risked becoming stories with no ending. This uncertainty weighed heavily on squadron morale. Officers reminded crews to stay focused, yet no words erased the image of a tail breaking off in the distance or a plume of smoke rising beneath them. Gunners tightened their harnesses, checked their oxygen lines, and revisited emergency procedures that offered safety only in theory. Inside the tail, a gunner sat alone with the knowledge that if catastrophe struck, his body might never be recovered, his presence remembered only through the absence he left behind. Families bore the longest burden. A missing son remained forever suspended in time, neither fully alive nor peacefully dead. Some parents refused to pack away their children's belongings, convinced that closure required a body, not a bureaucratic statement. Others accepted the truth, but found it impossible to let go, replaying imagined scenarios of their son's final moments. Did he feel fear? Did he die instantly? Did he understand what was happening? No answers ever arrived. The war moved on. Documents were filed, new crews took flight, but the silence left behind by those missing lingered for decades. Society honoured courage broadly, but individuals lost without witnesses often disappeared from public memory. Their sacrifice remained as real as any other soldiers, yet the absence of detail, the absence of narrative, pushed them into the margins of history. They fought, suffered, and died in the same terrifying skies as their peers, but without recovery, their stories lacked the closure that gives memory weight. They became names carved into stone, entries in dusty archives, photographs tucked into drawers by families who carried sorrow in private. To imagine the last seconds inside a disintegrating tail is to acknowledge a cold solitude unique to that position. The gunner fought until metal crumpled beneath him, until the wind tore through the frame, until the sky itself consumed him. There was no final message, no farewell, no one to hold witness as he disappeared into the vastness below. Isolation defined not only his duty, but also his ending. This quiet vanishing reveals how war could swallow identities whole, leaving families with questions that never found a voice. It moves naturally into a reflection on those who endured every mission under a shadow of loneliness, carrying burdens unseen by the world. Hidden within that solitude rests the final truth of a role whose sacrifices rarely reached the surface of memory. Endurance inside the tail compartment was not measured in missions completed or enemies struck, but in the quiet persistence of men who carried a burden no one else fully understood. Every day they stepped into the narrow space at the end of the bomber, they accepted a role that asked for everything while promising almost nothing in return. Their station was built around solitude, and solitude shaped the nature of their service. They watched the sky alone, listened to the engines alone, and braced for impact alone. Even as the rest of the crew worked only a few meters away, the metal walls between them created an emotional distance far harder to bridge than the physical one. Among the thousands of airmen who served during the long years of the war, tail gunners were some of the least acknowledged. Their position offered no glory, no sweeping view of the battlefield, no admired stories of daring maneuvers or split-second decisions that saved entire squadrons. Instead, their stories unfolded in a narrow tube of glass and steel, where survival often meant remaining unseen, unheard, and unspoken. They carried out their duty quietly, without expectation of recognition or reward, relying only on their patience and discipline to withstand conditions that would have broken many others. The silence surrounding their contribution was not created by apathy. It was created by the nature of the role itself. Their danger was constant yet invisible, their labour essential yet hidden from view. Much of the world learned about the war through images of bombers soaring in formation, or photographs of crews posing together on the ground. Tail gunners rarely appeared in such images. They stood at the edge of the group, or sometimes were absent entirely, having remained with the aircraft while the rest of the crew gathered. Their contributions lived inside mission logs, not in the stories retold to the public. Even their teammates understood only part of what the tail gunner endured. The intercom carried their voice, but the intercom could not carry their fear. The cold in the rear was sharper, the vibration worse, the exposure greater. Bullets that grazed the fuselage near the centre of the plane might only leave scratches, but bullets that struck the tail could pull the structure apart. When enemy fighters approached, they came almost always from the direction guarded by the tail gunner. The first bursts of fire were aimed directly at him. His responsibility was to hold the line alone. His victory was often survival, not triumph. For many gunners, the greatest struggle came not from the enemy, but from the absence of acknowledgement. They knew that their warning calls, their bursts of defensive fire, and their constant vigilance protected the rest of the crew. Yet their role was framed as secondary, necessary, but not celebrated. There were medals for pilots who navigated storms, and machine gunners who defended the top turret, but few honours dedicated solely to the men at the rear. They finished missions, counted their days, and stepped quietly away from service when the war ended, returning to civilian life as though their sacrifices were no different from anyone else's. Some carried invisible wounds long after the war. The isolation they faced inside the aircraft lingered in their thoughts, creating habits of silence that followed them into old age. Many spoke little of their service, not because they wished to forget, but because they believed no one would understand the weight of what they had endured. They kept their memories folded neatly inside, just as families kept their uniforms stored carefully in closets. The world moved forward, celebrating victory and rebuilding what had been lost. But the stillness that filled the tail compartment never left these men entirely. Their contributions were woven into every bomber that returned safely. When crews felt the aircraft shudder under enemy fire but continued flying, they owed part of that survival to the gunner who watched the sky with relentless attention. When enemy fighters withdrew, unable to find a vulnerable angle, it was often because the man in the tail kept them at bay. His presence shaped the rhythm of each mission, even if his name rarely appeared in public accounts. He offered stability in chaos, clarity in confusion, and courage in moments where hesitation meant disaster. Yet despite their enduring service, there are few monuments dedicated specifically to tail gunners. Memorials honour entire crews, entire branches, entire generations, but the position at the back of the plane remains symbolically as quiet as it was physically. This absence does not diminish their legacy, it deepens it. Their sacrifice existed in a space where recognition was never the goal, where survival for the collective mattered more than survival of the self. They entered the tail knowing the risks, knowing the odds, and knowing that their story might end without witnesses. Time has softened the memory of many wartime roles, but the image of the tail gunner remains stark and striking. He sits alone beneath a canopy of glass, scanning the endless sky while the bomber drones forward, unaware of the dangers behind it. He holds his position through bitter cold, violent shaking, sudden silence, and the terror of facing enemy fire with no shield beyond his own resolve. He fights not for fame, but for the lives of the men he cannot see from his compartment. His isolation becomes an act of devotion. His endurance becomes a final testament. To reflect on these men is to understand the profound cost of being unseen. Their sacrifices made missions possible, helped aircraft return home, and protected lives that went on to build futures long after the war. Their names may not fill history books, but their legacy is carried forward in the gratitude of those who survived. Because a solitary figure at the back of the plane never abandoned his post. Every safe landing, every completed mission, every reunion after the war owed something to the vigilance of a gunner who remained steady and alert, while danger crept ever closer. Somewhere in the cold, quiet sky where these men once guarded the rear of the bomber, their presence still feels tangible. A reminder that courage often grows strongest in places where recognition never reaches. This remembrance captures how their service shaped every journey, even when their stories faded into the background. It leads naturally toward acknowledging the depth of their endurance, which held entire crews together through moments of unthinkable strain. Hidden in that endurance lies a final truth about those who protected others from a distance no one else could bear. Thank you for spending this quiet time honouring the unseen courage of these men. Rest gently, breathe deeply, and let your mind drift into calm. Good night.